March 1944. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara, one of Japan's most accomplished codebreakers, was experiencing something he had never felt in 15 years of military intelligence work: complete intellectual defeat. The transmission crackling through his headphones shouldn't have been impossible to decode. His team had shattered British naval codes, penetrated American diplomatic traffic, broken the State Department's most sensitive ciphers before Pearl Harbor. They had given the Japanese Empire its strategic vision. But these Marine radio broadcasts, intercepted before every American attack, clearly structured, obviously coordinated, remained utterly impenetrable. The sounds were beautiful, almost musical, rising and falling like mountain winds, snapping with the rhythm of running water. They felt like language. But no language his linguists had ever encountered. Inside the windowless analysis room at a WADA communications facility, 3 cryptographers hunched over oscilloscopes, mapping waveforms onto graph paper. Lieutenant Yamada adjusted the playback speed to 1/4 normal, trying to isolate individual phonemes. The slowed transmission sounded even more alien: guttural stops, nasal vowels, tones that seemed to shift mid-syllable. "Still nothing?" Kurihara asked, though he already knew the answer. Yamada shook his head. "Sir, we've identified approximately 47 distinct sounds. Some don't exist in Japanese, English, or any European language we've catalogued. The tonal variations suggest meaning, like Chinese, but the patterns don't match any documented tonal system." On the adjacent table, frequency analysis charts lay scattered like failed prophecies. In every previous code-breaking operation, frequency patterns had provided the first breakthrough. Certain sounds or symbols always appeared more often, revealing the underlying structure. But these transmissions defied statistical logic. No consistent repetition, no recognizable patterns. Nothing. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Professor Takeshi Matsumoto, linguistics specialist from Tokyo Imperial University, had spent 3 days reviewing the recordings. His conclusion, delivered that morning, had been devastating. This is either an extraordinarily sophisticated artificial language created specifically to resist analysis, or it represents a natural language from such an isolated population that it developed entirely outside known linguistic evolution. Either way, gentlemen, you're not breaking this with conventional methods. Kurihara walked to the wall map studded with red pins, each marking a location where these mysterious transmissions had been intercepted. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, every major marine operation over the past 18 months. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever these transmissions appeared, American tactical coordination became flawless. Japanese defensive positions, carefully concealed, were hit with impossible precision. Ambushes failed because Marines seemed to anticipate every movement. His superiors in Tokyo were demanding answers. Naval Command wanted to know how Americans were achieving such perfect battlefield communication. Army intelligence insisted there must be a mechanical cipher device they hadn't identified yet. But Kurihara knew the truth was simpler and far more troubling. This wasn't a machine. These were human voices, speaking something that shouldn't exist in modern warfare. A code without keys, without patterns, without any reference point in their entire intelligence archive. He removed his headphones and set them carefully on the desk, next to his cold tea. Outside, cherry blossoms were beginning to fall, marking another spring of war. Inside this sealed room, Japan's finest cryptographic minds were failing against an enemy they couldn't even identify. What Kurihara didn't know, what no Japanese intelligence officer would comprehend until long after surrender, was that he was listening to the only code in modern military history that would never be broken. The answer lay not in Tokyo's libraries or laboratories, but 7,000 miles away, in the wind-carved mesas and red desert canyons of the American Southwest. The story begins not in the Pacific Theater, but in the American Southwest, where for centuries the Navajo people had preserved a language unlike anything else on Earth. Diné Bizard, the Navajo language, belonged to the Athabascan linguistic family, spoken by approximately 50,000 Navajo across the 27,000-square-mile reservation spanning northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, and portions of Utah and Colorado. The linguistic characteristics that would paralyze Japanese codebreakers had evolved over millennia in geographic isolation. Navajo is fundamentally verb-centered, with actions described through prefix combinations numbering in the millions. A single verb stem can generate thousands of distinct meanings through prefixing alone. The language employs 4 contrastive tones, high, low, rising, falling, that completely transform word definitions. A slight mispronunciation doesn't just change meaning, it renders entire sentences incomprehensible. The phonology includes sounds absent from most world languages, ejective stops produced using the glottis rather than lung air, voiceless lateral fricatives resembling wind through clenched teeth, glottalized sonorants, nasalized vowels with no European equivalents. For Japanese cryptographers trained in a language with 5 vowel sounds and no tonal variation, even hearing these phonemes accurately was neurologically impossible. Philip Johnston understood this linguistic fortress's military potential better than any man alive. Born in 1892 to Protestant missionaries on the Navajo reservation, Johnston had grown up speaking Navajo fluently, one of fewer than 30 non-Navajos worldwide who could make that claim. By age 9, he was translating his father's sermons. By 15, he had traveled to Washington to interpret for Navajo leaders, where he met President Theodore Roosevelt. In December 1941, as America reeled from Pearl Harbor, Johnston read about Louisiana National Guard units experimenting with Comanche speakers during training exercises. He envisioned something revolutionary, a formalized military code based entirely on Navajo structure, one that would be simultaneously unbreakable and faster than any encryption machine. On February 28, 1942, Johnston presented his proposal to Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott near San Diego. The demonstration was extraordinary. 4 Navajo men transmitted typical battlefield messages, while Marine officers timed them against standard encryption procedures. Result: Navajo transmission averaged 20 seconds. The M209 cipher machine required 30 minutes. General Vogel authorized an experimental program immediately. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were sworn into the Marine Corps at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. These men, including Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, Lloyd Oliver, John Benally, came from across the sprawling reservation. Some had attended boarding schools where speaking Navajo earned physical punishment. Others were traditional sheep herders who had rarely left their ancestral lands. At Camp Elliott, they worked in a locked, guarded building for 8 weeks, creating a military code within their native language under absolute secrecy. They built the code through cultural logic, translating modern warfare into vivid Navajo metaphors. A submarine became beshlo, iron fish swimming beneath the surface. A battleship was lotso, whale. the ocean's largest creature. Fighter planes were da heti hai, hummingbirds darting through air. Bombers were jaisho, buzzards circling before descending. The alphabet system required special ingenuity. Each letter needed multiple Navajo words to defeat frequency analysis. The letter A received 3 options: Wallachi, Anti, Belasana, Apple, Tsinil, Axe. The letter E received 4 alternatives. Code talkers would randomly rotate through options, destroying any statistical patterns. They developed 201 initial terms, memorizing everything perfectly. No codebooks could be written. Capture would mean immediate compromise. Chester Nez later recalled, "We drilled endlessly, thousands of repetitions. A transmission error could cost lives. In our culture, words carry sacred power. Speaking correctly was survival." By August 1942, they were ready for war. The language Japan couldn't break was about to become America's secret weapon. Guadalcanal, August 7, 1942. 15 code talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division on Red Beach, radios strapped to their backs, stepping into hell. Within hours, the first combat transmission crackled across marine frequencies. Code talker, private first class. Chester Nez pressed the handset to his lips and spoke in the language of his ancestors. Beshlo di Behyadzi, Bealdo Chiddahi. Submarine. Sheep. Uncle. Ram. Ice. 20 seconds. Complete artillery coordinates transmitted, received, confirmed. 7,000 miles away, Japanese radio operators intercepted the transmission. At the 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul, intelligence officers scrambled to identify what they were hearing. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, Stanford-educated and fluent in English, played the recording 3 times. His report to superiors was brief and alarming. Structured communication. Military timing, coordinated across multiple units. Language matches nothing in our archives. Not English, French, Dutch, Spanish, any Philippine dialect, any Chinese variant. Completely alien. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese intelligence couldn't anticipate American movements. Marines advanced with impossible coordination. Artillery strikes landed with surgical precision. Flanking maneuvers materialized from nowhere. Japanese defensive positions, carefully concealed and previously secure, were overrun with devastating efficiency. Colonel Haruo Konuma wrote in his operational diary, "The Americans have deployed a communication system that defeats every analytical approach. We can no longer predict battalion-level movements. We are fighting blind." The Japanese response was systematic and desperate. Top cryptanalysts recorded hundreds of hours on wax cylinders. University linguists analyzed phonetic patterns. Buddhist scholars studied the recordings for ancient language connections. Mathematical cryptographers applied frequency analysis, tonal mapping, every technique known to imperial intelligence. Nothing worked. Then, in April 1942, Japan captured what they believed was their breakthrough. Private Joe Kiyumiya, a Navajo soldier taken at Bataan, months before the Code Talker program even began. When Japanese cryptographers started regularly intercepting Navajo transmissions, they transferred Kiyumiya to the Ofuna Interrogation Center. They played him hours of recorded Code Talker communications. Kiyumiya heard Navajo words, but in completely nonsensical combinations. The turtle attacks the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs toward the whale. When he couldn't translate the military meaning, interrogators accused him of protecting secrets. The torture escalated over 16 months. Water torture, beatings, suspension by bound arms, starvation. In January 1943, they forced him to stand barefoot in snow for 6 hours until his feet froze to the ground. Through everything, Kiyumiya repeated the same truth. "I understand the individual words. I cannot tell you what they mean together. I don't know the code. A declassified Japanese intelligence report from May 1943 documented their failure. Subject demonstrates fluency in target language, but cannot interpret military transmissions. Enhanced interrogation produced no intelligence value. Assessment: code structure exists beyond linguistic knowledge. Meanwhile, across Tarawa, Bougainville, and the Marshall Islands, code talkers proved their value in battle after battle. November 1942. Tarawa Atoll. Code talker. Corporal Henry Bake transmitted 48 consecutive messages during the bloodiest 76 hours of the Pacific Campaign. 0 errors, 0 delays. Japanese intercepted every transmission and understood nothing. Marine Major Howard Connor, signal officer at Iwo Jima, would later state, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The code Japan couldn't break was winning the war. And the code talkers were just getting started. By 1945, their numbers would grow to over 400, operating across every major Pacific theater. But their finest hour was still ahead. February 19th, 1945, 900 hours, Iwo Jima. 6 Navajo code talkers hit the black volcanic beach with the first assault wave, radios already crackling with coordinates, casualties, urgent requests for fire support. The island was a fortress. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months transforming Iwo Jima into the most heavily defended position in military history. 11 miles of underground tunnels, 1,500 concealed gun positions, 21,000 entrenched Japanese soldiers ordered to kill 10 Americans each before dying themselves. Kuribayashi's strategy depended on one principle: chaos. Disrupt American communication, delay coordination, force Marines into killing zones where superior firepower meant nothing. He hadn't planned for the code talkers. Corporal Henry Bake, Jr. crouched in a shell crater. Mortars screaming overhead and transmitted artillery coordinates in rapid Navajo. Wu tso, dibe, momi, tuizi. Whale, sheep, coyote, goat, battleship Pennsylvania, grid coordinates, target priority, ammunition type, 12 seconds. The naval guns adjusted. 30 seconds later, a concealed Japanese artillery position ceased to exist. For 48 hours straight, the 6 code talkers operated without sleep, without relief, transmitting over 800 messages across the expanding battlefield. 0 errors, 0 delays, 0 compromised intelligence. Private First Class Preston Toledo worked through a mortar barrage that killed 3 men within 10 feet of his position. He never stopped transmitting. When shrapnel tore through his equipment, he switched to a backup radio without missing a word. Corporal Joe Gatewood coordinated naval gunfire support, while artillery shells exploded close enough to throw sand across his radio set. His voice remained steady, precise, methodical, the same tone he'd use calling sheep back to the fold on his family's land in New Mexico. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring from Mount Suribachi's tunnels, intercepted every transmission. They recognized the patterns now, the timing, the military precision, the coordinated attacks. But recognition meant nothing without comprehension. Colonel Nishi Takeichi, commanding the 26th Tank Regiment, wrote in his final report before his death on March 22nd, "American tactical communication remains impenetrable. Our defensive positions are located and destroyed with impossible speed. They coordinate 3-division assaults in real time. We cannot counter what we cannot understand." Kuribayashi's carefully orchestrated defense collapsed not from overwhelming force, though American firepower was devastating, but from perfect information flow. Marines called airstrikes on hidden positions seconds after spotting them. Artillery corrections happened in real time. Medical evacuations arrived before radio operators finished describing casualties. Reinforcements moved with supernatural coordination. The code talkers made it look easy, but the cost was brutal. They worked until their voices failed, then kept transmitting. They handled radio equipment with hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. They maintained perfect accuracy, while friends died beside them. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division signal officer, watched them work and understood what was happening. After the battle, he would write in his report, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." 36 days of combat, 26,000 American casualties, nearly 7,000 dead. But the island fell, in large part because 6 Navajo Marines spoke a language that turned military communication into an unbreakable weapon. When the flag rose on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, code talkers were still transmitting, still coordinating, still speaking the words that won battles. Japan's most impenetrable fortress had been defeated by America's most unbreakable code. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrenders. In the ruins of the Owada Communications Facility, Commander Atsuzo Kurihara compiled his final intelligence report. Among the technical assessments and operational failures, one section stood out. American Marine Communication System designated Unknown Language Alpha remained unbroken throughout entire conflict. Despite allocation of significant analytical resources, deployment of enhanced interrogation methods, and consultation with leading linguistic experts, Imperial intelligence achieved zero cryptographic penetration. Assessment: most secure battlefield communication system encountered in modern warfare. He had finally learned the truth. It was Navajo, a language spoken by fewer than 50,000 people on a remote American reservation. A language so obscure that Japan's vast intelligence apparatus had never catalogued its existence. The admission felt like defeat piled upon defeat. But for the Navajo code talkers returning home, victory brought no celebration, only silence. The program was immediately classified top secret. Code talkers received no public recognition, no medals, no acknowledgement of their service. Military officials worried the code might be needed for future conflicts. The men who had transmitted over 800,000 messages without a single error were ordered to never speak about what they'd done. Many returned to the same reservation communities they'd left, but everything had changed. They carried memories of Guadalcanal's jungles, Iwo Jima's black sand, friends dying beside them while they transmitted coordinates in their grandfather's language. They couldn't tell anyone. Carl Gorman came home to a Bureau of Indian Affairs office that initially refused him veterans' benefits. They claimed his service record was incomplete because entire sections were redacted. He worked construction jobs, carrying classified secrets he couldn't share even with his own family. Chester Nez returned to herding sheep in the high desert, the same landscape where he'd learned the language that had helped win a war. At night, he heard phantom radio static and the voices of Marines calling for fire support. The nightmares came in both English and Navajo. Many code talkers faced the same discrimination they'd experienced before the war. Restaurants refused service, housing was denied, job applications disappeared. They had fought for a country that still saw them as second-class citizens. Joe Kiyumiya, tortured for 16 months in Japanese prison camps, came home with permanent injuries and memories that wouldn't fade. He received no special recognition for his suffering. The program he'd unknowingly protected remained classified. Some found healing through traditional Navajo ceremonies. Medicine men performed enemy way rituals, cleansing warriors of the spiritual contamination of combat. The ceremonies helped some men sleep again. Others remained haunted. Code talker Thomas Begay later recalled, "We won the war speaking the language they tried to beat out of us in boarding schools. Then we came home and couldn't tell anyone. We were heroes nobody knew about. For 23 years, the code talkers remained America's secret. Their families knew they'd served. Their communities honored them as veterans. But the full truth, the magnitude of their contribution, the battles won through their voices, the fact that they'd created the only unbroken code in modern military history, remained locked in classified files. The silence was its own kind of combat. And it would last nearly a generation. 1968. 23 years after victory, the Department of Defense finally declassified the Navajo Code Talker program. The men who had kept America's most vital secret could finally speak. For the original 29, those who had created the code in a locked room at Camp Elliott, the recognition came with bittersweet relief. Some had carried the silence for so long, it had become part of their identity. Others had passed away, never receiving public acknowledgement for what they'd accomplished. But the truth was finally emerging. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th National Navajo Code Talkers Day. The men who had transmitted 800,000 messages without error were finally honored as the strategic asset they'd always been. Carl Gorman, now in his 70s, stood before crowds and told stories he'd kept silent for decades. "We took the language the government tried to destroy in boarding schools," he said, "and we used it to save this country." The recognition accelerated. In 2001, President George W. Bush presented Congressional Gold Medals, Congress's highest civilian honor, to the original 29 code talkers. Only 5 survived to receive their medals in person. Chester Nez, then 80 years old, accepted his medal with tears streaming down his face. "This medal honors all of us who served," he said, "but especially those who never came home, and those who came home but died before anyone knew what we'd done." The ceremony was broadcast nationwide. For the first time, America understood the full scope of what had happened in the Pacific. A group of young Navajo men had wielded their indigenous language as a weapon more powerful than any technology, and Japan's finest intelligence minds had been utterly defeated by it. The legacy extended beyond individual recognition. Navajo language programs, once suppressed and punished, experienced revival. Schools on the reservation began teaching Dinebizad with pride rather than shame. Young Navajos learned that their language wasn't a barrier to success. It was proof of resilience, complexity, and strategic value. Indigenous contributions to American military history gained overdue prominence. The code talkers became symbols of a larger truth. Diversity isn't America's challenge, it's America's strength. The language Japanese cryptographers couldn't break. The language boarding schools tried to erase, the language that existed for centuries in desert isolation, had proven essential to defending democracy itself. By 2024, the Navajo code talkers were celebrated in museums, documentaries, and textbooks. Their story became required learning, not just as military history, but as a lesson about the power of cultural preservation and the strategic value of linguistic diversity. The final code talker, Thomas H. Begay, passed away in 2024 at age 97. His death marked the end of a generation, but not the end of their legacy. Today, the code remains unbroken. Not because it's still classified. The military declassified the complete code vocabulary in 1968, but because its complexity still defies easy replication. Even with full documentation, the speed, accuracy, and fluency required to operate, the code effectively demands years of cultural immersion. Commander Kurihara spent 18 hours trying to break a single transmission in 1944. 80 years later, that transmission would still confound him. The Navajo code-talkers proved something profound. America's greatest strategic advantage wasn't industrial capacity or technological innovation. It was the irreplaceable diversity of its people. Their voices, once silenced, won a war. And their language, unbroken then, unbroken now, endures